I've got a little landscape and I want to have, so in my landscape, let me actually block a few things in with just sort of, we'll zoom down on this, zoom down, all right. So I'm going to have a foreground, I'm going to have a middle ground, and I am going to have some form of a background back there. And but in my foreground plane here, there's a bunch of bushes. We can also think of this in terms of there's going to be bushes in the foreground here, and on the background there are going to be in this middle, in the middle ground hills here, there are going to be some oaks. So in the foreground there are some clumps of coyote brush down here. And I want those to look like bushes, but on the hill behind them, there are oaks. And those oaks are kind of scattered around, and some of them are kind of coming up little draws here. Here will be another draw. Here, there's some oaks covering this part here. And I want my bushes to be bushes. I want my oaks to be oaks. And so how do I go about doing that? Well, one thing that's going to be challenging is that our brains will tend to, if two things are the same size, your brain will decide that those two objects are the same distance away from you. But let's say one is really big and far away, and one is small and close up. I can get my big far away. Here's my ground plane. So these two things are right next to each other. This creates a visually confusing situation where I have big far away, small close up, but then the general size of these shapes ends up being the same. So I'm going to be fighting against size. And so I'm going to have to use some other clues to put these trees here in the background and have these bushes be stuff in the foreground. So I can do this. I'll show you a few different strategies that I can use for this. For these clumps of bushes that I have here in the foreground, I don't want all my bush clumps to be the same size. If I have a bunch of bush clumps and they're all kind of like this, it'll look way too kind of topiary symmetrical. So I'm going to have one be kind of a longer one sort of medium-sized one here, and I'm just going to try to kind of break up the size of those, and then a larger one over here. One of the tools I'm going to use here is I'm going to sort of around the outside edge of this little coyote brush here, I'm going to make a little kind of leafy line. And by a leafy line, what I mean is just sort of a line that is sort of feeling like it's kind of randomly kind of getting up, big, small, down. Someplace it's broken, someplace there's a little kind of leafy thing. But you see how that little line, I'm not doing this. But I've got, and if this feels too disjunct, I can even add a little kind of connector to that. And this will be my little kind of leaf mass. So I've got this little leaf mass here. I've got this one here. And this little one back here. I'm going to think about what happens when this bush touches down with the ground. How does this bush touch down with the ground? Some bushes, there's foliage really far down. Others, it's more spare at the bottom. So you're seeing the branches more, right? So I'm going to maybe put in a few little kind of branches down in here. But as you get up into the bushes, those, I'm going to kind of, you're going to get less of that. Also, this under part of the bush is shaded. So there is some kind of dark down here. And some dark towards the base of this. And as the light catches on the side of it, I am just going to, in here, put a few little kind of hatching marks. So hatching marks are kind of lines like this, and I can change my direction. I can create an area of volume and sort of suggest clumps of things. So I'm going to put a little bit of hatching here, and you notice that I'm kind of leaving an outer rim of this on the outside edge of it where there's even more light catching it. And that gives me these kind of cool edges where this part of this bush meets this part of this bush. I can also get things darker in here with what's called cross hatching. Cross hatching is if I make other lines at a different direction across these other lines, just as you are doing cross hatching. So if I want to kind of darken these in here, I'm going to go just a slightly different angle in there. The cardinal rule of cross hatching is don't do this. Don't make squares. Squares are not your hatching friend. What your hatching friend is lines that come at an angle to the other ones. So you don't want to create a mesh. You don't want to create a screen door. All right. So I'm going to have a big bush over here. And on this one here, I'm going to kind of have fun. I'm going to break the little hatching marks at this point, just to give you a little bit of, there's more bush, kind of other little clumps of this bush that are in front of this. This gives you a little bit of depth. Kind of, you get the sense that there are little bushes in front of the big bushes. I'm also going to give you a little bit of grass down here, just a few little, this hillside, I've got a few places where I'm putting in these little marks that are suggesting like this is some grass here. Now, if I want to be even more explicit about the size of the things that I'm seeing here by these little bushes, I need to give somebody a reference, some scale. So if there is perhaps a deer that is walking around back here, here's sort of a back butt view of deer. We could have made that a camel. But when you see this critter in here, you now have a sense of how big those bushes are because there's something for scale. If I made the deer this big, then you go like, oh, those are really little bushes. But this kind of the sense of the size of the deer and the size of the grass gives you a size of the bush. And again, my big trick for the bush is there's this outside edge that is this sort of broken line. And then as I'm shading in that, I'm going to let the upper edges of that catch a little bit more. More light. Now, what about that hill behind it? I don't want those to look like more bushes going up that hill. I want those to be distant oaks. So a couple of things I'm going to do. In my foreground zone, which is this area here, that's going to be the part of my drawing that is going to get more detail on it. As I go into these back hills here, I'm going to use less detail, and I'm not going to press as hard with my ballpoint pen. I'm going to use a lighter line, and that is going to help that stuff in the background feel. All right, so here is, and also, so remember that little line that I had before, there's like this. So for these back ones, I'm going to use a line that is lighter and less nuanced, less jiggly. So back here, I was going to have a line of oaks coming up here, but that's right where my deer is. And so if I put the oaks right around the deer, it'll really confuse this part of the drawing. So I'm not going to do that to you. Instead, I might put some oaks coming up here and some behind the ridge there. All right, now I want these not to have some value in on them. So I'm going to do a similar sort of thing, but instead of all this kind of fussiness that's going on in here, I am going to just use one direction of line so I won't be cross-hatching it. I can avoid the upper edge of it, the parts of the oak trees that are caught in the sunlight. So I've got detail as well as my line thickness, helping the viewer sort of see what is foreground, what is middle ground, and what is background there. And for scale size, I just sort of zoom back. So this is the size of this drawing. So this is maybe a couple inches high. But I can still get a lot of sort of a sense of depth in that. If I want to, I can also add color to it. I'm just going to drop a little bit of color into it. Background, hills. I'm going to go blue. Let's zoom back down on that. Some middle ground, get a little bit warmer. Keeping these hills simple. I don't want to get too much detail in on them, or they will appear to pop into the foreground. I think I do want these oak trees to feel a little bit darker. And then in the foreground, the foreground is going to get more saturated, vivid colors. And more detail with the brushstroke. So you can see in the background, it's basically a solid wash going across there. And in the foreground, you sort of see the roughness of the paper. I think this deer needs better ears. Oh, just turned into a burrow. Let's see, a little bit of sky. For the sky, I'm going to put a wash of brown into the lower sky here, sort of an ochre color, and let that fade into a blue. Did that wet and wet so those colors joined into each other. So now as I squint at it, you'll notice that there's the values. It's just squint at the page, right? You squint at it and you go like, whoa, the darks and the lights in this are very, very, very similar. So I'm now just going to kind of go into it and I'm going to boost my make this a little bit darker. Get a little bit more contrast. Make my trees a little bit darker. I'm going to add some darks in underneath some of these bushes here. And maybe just a little bit more vibrant color in part of my foreground. That was a lot more than I expected. Looks like one of those airplanes came over that drops all the orange fire retardant. Okay, but we kicked that back a little bit. Put some kind of evening orange colors into this. And there we go. So you get a sense that there are some bushes in there. And there's some distant trees. I didn't even put any green in with those trees. There's a tendency for us to want to make distant trees green because trees are green and trees have to be green and trees are supposed to be green. I can get away with that if I'm really subtle with it, but so here's just a little hint of some green going into these trees. But you'll find that I'm now going to put some more bold green into them because we know that trees are supposed to be green. And you'll see that the effect just starts to feel a lot more kind of coloring book, kind of comic. It's sort of the way that you think it's supposed to look, but it doesn't. So if I get in here and I just draw these trees all green, because trees are supposed to be green, I think it looks a little bit more kind of cartoony. It feels like those aren't in the same light as everything else. Oh no, it's watercolor. You can't undo it. Well, you might be able to undo a little bit of it. While it's still damp, I'm just going to take a piece of paper, press that down into it. A lot of that's coming up. And then I am going to just redarken it with a little bit of some purple gray. I go sort of evening light on a deer with some bushes. Avea, what's topic number 2?
Okay, so keeping in the theme with plants, what about cherry blossom tree when it's only the flowers all over it and not yet them?
Oh, a great question. And for this, we are going to go with toned paper. All right. So toned paper is wonderful for something like cherry blossom branches. So I've got my little branch. I wish I had a cherry blossom. I'm going to have to make up a cherry blossom branch. So I'm thinking I'm going to have some blossoms down here. In here, this is going to kind of come up. It's going to be a little bit craggly. And there are going to be some buds. But toned paper is wonderful for these things. Some people go about sort of trying to memorize specific brush strokes for cherry blossom branches and these sort of things. I recommend just actually going out and sitting next to the cherry blossom branch, and you want to look at that one instead of having it feel like cherry blossom branches. You want it to be just a chance to look at that specific branch. I'm going to do this with pen, and let's see which pen here. Oh, some of my pens have walked away from my little kit here. Well, I'm going to use my ballpoint pen then. Yeah, I think that's what I'll do. So cherry blossoms with ballpoint pen. So let's say what I do once I've kind of got my branch, if you look in here, there is non-photo blue pencil or blue pencil that is blocking in the general locations of where I've got my of where I have my flowers and things. And there's another one that is roughly going to be in here. The center of it is there. And I have 1 petal, 2 petal, 3 petal, 4, 5. This one I'm drawing in a little bit less kind of bold pen because it's tucked behind this other one. Just even in this much space, as things are kind of setting behind other ones, I use a lighter line and a little bit less detail. It just helps pop this one out in front of that one a little bit. Then over here is a little bud that is starting to come out. And something that's going to make this sort of feel, I want to kind of look at along the branch, where are there kind of, you know, imperfections, sort of changes in the angle of the branch. This one over here is just starting to open. Something that is, you want to kind of look for where are there sort of stretches of branch that are kind of, you know, more straight and curved. Where do they turn and just get crookedy? So just the contrast of having like a little place be straighter and then this place here be really crookedy. It's going to be more visually interesting than if it's all crookedy, because it's contrast. This feels crookedy because this part here is straight. And the reason that I did this on toned paper is that, well, you then get to put white on it. And that's so much fun. Just like this little thing here, you know, when you look at the cherry blossom trees, those little white flowers pop out so strongly. So when I get to come in here and just with my white pencil, come in and drop in a few of those, oh, it's so much fun. That really then stands out off the page. I can also use gouache to do that. Gouache has some advantages and disadvantages over the white colored pencil. So what I've got is here in my palette, I've got a little chunk of dried permanent white gouache. I like that better than the Chinese white gouache. It's permanent white. And what I do is I just get it a little bit damp and I squizzle it with my brush tip. That's an official term. until it's a little bit of a thick paste. And I want to then rub that thick paste onto there. There's sort of just, this isn't quite to the point where it's really flowing. That's better. That's what I want. I want it just to the point where I'm sort of moving around this paste, this cream, but it still is able to flow a little bit. And I get these really nice, bright, bold whites. You notice that that's white. It's a whiter white than you get with the pencil. Might even go over some of these little pencil parts here. And though the generally speaking, paint doesn't like to go on top of pencil because it's so waxy. But this is thick, so thick that it's basically staying where I tell it to. As I go in here on this one, it's going to be a little bit more shaded down in the middle of this flower. So I am going to let some of the color of the paper stick through in the middle of it. And if part of your drawing seems too pale, you can with the gouache, you can add another little coat over it. So you can put gouache on top of gouache, and it gets brighter and brighter and brighter. Another nice thing that with the white gouache is it's really easy to tint different colors. I'm cleaning my brush right now. So if I take a little bit of pink paint, hold on, somebody's just come to the front door and I'm here alone. Avea, if there's any other sort of comments in there that you wanted to sort of share, please do. I'm going to just drop away and see what's going on at the front door.
Absolutely. So one of the things that is helpful, and I'm also going to reference what we just did with the bushes, is that what Jack was doing with his gosh, I can't think of the word. He was making a point to keep the background not nearly as vivid as the foreground. And that's something to keep in mind when you're doing the landscapitos, is to make sure that the background doesn't overwhelm the foreground. So he was making sure that the colors of the trees, like what he was saying with the trees not being as bright, to make sure that it didn't overwhelm the bushes and the deer in the foreground. And he also beforehand did lighter hatching. So that's interesting to notice right there. Okay, I have a question here about which white is titanium white and which is zinc white, and lead white is completely discontinued. I honestly don't know the different types very well. I just know the gouache versus the Chinese white that came in my kit. So the gouache white is a lot stronger, more staying power.
Hey, I'm back. Sorry about that, everybody. I just wanted to show people that with what I've got here is a little bit of magenta paint, and I can take that and you can tint into the blossoms if there's pinks in there. So you don't need to have a kit that has all the different colors of gouache, of all the different colors in it for your gouache paint. You can just have a little bit of white, because you can just go around and then you tint that. Let's say the middle of those have some bright yellow in it. I'll just tint that. Little bit of For inspiration, I would take a look at brush painting, drawings of from China, Japan, places like that, where kind of drawing the cherry blossom branch is it's a practice. It's something that people really get into, and there's a lot of thought and wonderful stuff that's been done with that. That would be, so my suggestion would be, if you don't have a tone paper journal, you can just cut out a few pieces of paper like this, and in your journal, as you're going around, just throw those in the back of your journal somewhere, and so that when you need pieces of toned paper, you can pull those out and then stick them into your journal. Where you do decide to use them, what you might want to do is, I always, when I do some things on a little piece of paper like this, I then forget that I did these, and then I fill up that whole page, and then all of a sudden, where do I put this thing? So something you can do is, when you do that, then just put it down on a piece of paper and kind of trace a square on your journal. And then you know where to take this and glue it in. Another thing that you can do, so let's say I'm here on this page, and I'm going to go jump to the next one. So here's a little glue stick. I'm going to take my glue stick, got a friend who does some scrapbooking stuff. Something that she does when she's using a glue stick is she runs the glue stick along the edge of a photograph and onto the piece of paper. So it's overlapping that edge. And then that's also going to be where you're going to put your piece of paper down. Then over those little glue smudges that I made, I'm going to put that in, flatten it down. But here's the really fun thing. Don't then consider this as a frame that nothing else can go into. It's just another piece of paper on your piece of paper, and get all collagey with that. So if you then have another drawing of another branch that's over here, you can have that come off the paper. And isn't that fun how the drawing then continues off here? Right. Similarly, the cherry blossoms are out. Just in time for Valentine's Day. My mom always used to, there's one street in San Francisco that has all these little cherry blossoms on it, and on Valentine's Day she loved to go check those out. But my writing has gone over the page here. So what that does is, when you're drawing into that, or you have, there's if you're sort of painting across that edge, um, it it just sort of makes that little inset feel like it's a part of that page, and that's fun. So a thing you might want consider adding to your sketch kit is just a little glue stick. This one's very loved, right? But a little glue stick goes a long way, and if you've got that, then it's just an invitation to drop all sorts of other neat stuff into your journal. I think I'm going to take this branch that's up here and kind of get it to go off the page too. It's fun. It's sort of the idea of, we sometimes talk about in when we're drawing birds and we're putting a background in with those birds, the idea of breaking the frame is a really kind of fun and playful thing to do. This is very much the same thing. So if I have, for instance, a little bird drawing, and I want to put in and I want to put in a little background with it. This is where I go off on tangents. I hope you all don't mind. All right, so here's a little bird. And you've drawn your little bird and you say, I don't think I want this bird just to be all lonely here in the middle of the blank white page. I would much rather have this bird be in an environment. So one thing you can do is to draw a frame around the bird and then put that in. But it's even more fun to have the bird break the frame. So by that, I mean have your, just as these kind of make that frame a semi-permeable membrane, right? Then you can do this. What if I have the frame here? Not centered on the bird. But instead, kind of show some sort of, habitat element here. Maybe there's a dune back there. But yeah, so here's the frame. And there is the camel. But it makes these sort of borders and walls we have sort of semi-permeable. Similarly, like this edge of this dune could even extend up this way, a little bit out of the frame. And you can play with some places you're sticking to the frame. You're for instance, as I put in this background here, I'm going to restrict that to the frame, but the bird is popping out of it, and the edge of that dune is popping out of it. That can be a really playful way of playing with elements and backgrounds. Yeah, just going back to this, notice how this, yeah, it's kind of sad. You know, nothing gets to kind of break outside of that little frame. Are we dry here? Nope. Well, it's okay. But what if this bush had actually kind of come out like this? And this edge here kind of out like that. Sometimes it's just, or if there's a little skein of birds, a little flock of geese flying across the sky here, those guys can continue off the page out of that frame. So you get to break those frames. And in the final 6 minutes, what'll it be, Eva?
Well, we did have some questions. There's a question from Nicholas about how to make the deer pop a bit more. And then Arlie was wondering which white is titanium white and which is zinc white, and is lead white now discontinued?
Yeah, if you have anything that says lead white, I would put that in the hazardous waste bin. The white that I use, I'll pull it out. It's called permanent white. And it is more opaque than I think it's the zinc white or the China. And where are we? Yeah. So some, like, you know, here's a tube of zinc white, and it's completely unused. Somebody gave this to me, and this tube is still as fresh as the day it was born. Here is my tube of permanent white. I got the big one, and I use it up regularly. So what I do is when this stuff in here starts to get low, I'll take my permanent white. Oh, it's not wanting to open. I actually might have to use, oh, there we go. And so all I do is I just squeeze some more of this into here. It's my permanent white. And I like to kind of get it up against the corners so that there's just more surface area. I put it in a fairly thin layer. A big glob of gouache tends to crack. And so if I put kind of more of a smear of it, I get less of that cracking. So these then become my gouache mixing places. And that's useful. So I use, so this is Holbein permanent white. You also can get permanent white Daniel Smith, but I would avoid the zinc white. It's just a little bit more transparent. This was shown to me originally by a woman who was a medical illustrator, and she would make all these drawings of organs inside a body, and they were accurate illustrations, but they didn't look wet. And then she would come along with some permanent white and just sort of add in some highlights and glistens, and all of a sudden, all these organs were sparkly and wet. And so I always, sort of, I always think of I always sort of think of that lesson, and whenever I'm putting this on, I'm sort of imagining that I'm making organs feel wet. So yeah, my recommendation is the permanent white. And were there oh, Loretta's got a cool comment here. She said, I found that before I replaced the watercolor tube's cap, I dipped the threaded section lightly in water, and it clears a bit and dampens the existing paint slightly, thereby the next time you open it, it'll open more easily. That's better than the approach which I use with grabbing a big pair of pliers and trying to yard on it. Are there any other questions you think we might be able to handle in the last minute?
Yes. One person, Linda, is asking who makes the white. And then,
mine is Holbein. Also, I generally use Holbein. And Winsor Newton is also, I've also used that.
Okay. And then we had one question from Nicholas about how to make the deer pop a bit more. Pop.
Let's go pop our deer. So if I really want the attention to be drawn to this deer, right, then something I can do is I can reinforce the lines around it. Let me kind of zoom down on it. If I want it to stand out more, then I'm going to right in here. I'm not with every line. I'm not going to do it, but around the underside here, maybe underside of the head, I'm going to just pop in some of those lines a little bit more boldly. If I do it around the whole thing, it will kind of flatten it out. But imagine a shape like this, and I want to kind of, actually I'm going to have two circles here. On one here, if I press hard all the way around this, okay, but meh. But if I, around this side here, if I pop that line and then let that line not be popped in on the top side, I have line variation here, and this ends up kind of almost looking like almost a little shadow effect even here. So I'm just putting that on the bottom side of this deer and not on the top side, and then that feels a little bit more shadowy. But notice how you've got that dark line on the bottom of the head here, not on the top. In just a moment, I'm going to darken it in all the way around. And I think what you're going to see is like, yeah, but I liked it better before. Right? So take a look at it now and watch it change. Just get a little bit like, yeah, that pops, but it was cooler with the line variation. I'm just going to come in here and strengthen this line also. This line also. It's strong, but now it just sort of feels like, it pops. You definitely see it. But I think it was more interesting when we had a little bit more of that line variation. So I can pop part of it, but if I pop the whole thing, then it's kind of like, look at this deer. And also the deer just sort of feels like a little bit more of a cutout. All right. And let's call that the hour. The one last sort of thought on breaking the box. Here it is. Yeah, our class is over, but we're still going. Is sometimes what I'll do is I'll have a drawing of a long landscape, right? I'll do something. There's a foreground, there's a middle ground, in the background, there's a little deer hanging out over there. And then what I do is I will pick like what part of that little long, and I'll just do that with line. with pencil or with a pen. Then you look at that and go like, what's my favorite part of that whole landscape? And I'll go like, I'm kind of interested in this part over here by the mountain. And I'll pick an interesting shaped box, and I'll put a box over the landscape. And this will be the part that I fill in with all sorts of detail or color. And so out of this whole landscape that's done really quickly and lightly, I've just taken one little piece and I'm going to zoom in and get all my detail on that. So if you're ever, you're pressed for time, or you're like, I don't want to get overwhelmed by this, but I want to play with that little part over here. That's a fun thing you can do. You can quickly block in the whole landscape, or even have that landscape be really gestural and loose. But then one little part, I'm going to draw a frame around that and tighten that up in there. And that can also be a lot of fun. So in one other just sort of strategy of breaking the box here, the box is coming in. The box isn't broken. The box is sort of feels like more of this afterthought after you've got your gestural landscape in there. And that's also a lot of fun to do.